I've called this section, or this video, The Return to Faith, because after the writer laid down his extensive teaching on the new covenant and the high priesthood of Christ, the ultimate issue is, will you believe this? Will you truly take what has been said to you here, the truth that you've been given, and believe that it is true, that it might bring forth confidence in your life so that you can persevere and endure the difficulties that you're facing. Now, of course, chapter 11 focuses on faith, but we need to run into that chapter with the latter part of chapter 10 just to set the context. So I want to begin reading at this reminder that the writer gives to the Hebrews in verse 32. But recall the former days, when after you were enlightened, you endured a hard struggle with sufferings, sometimes being publicly exposed to reproach and affliction, and sometimes being partners with those so treated. For you had compassion on those in prison, and you joyfully accepted the plunder of your property, since you knew that you yourselves had a better possession and an abiding one. Therefore, do not throw away your confidence, which has great reward. For you have need of endurance, so that when you have done the will of God, you will receive what is promised. For, and then he quotes Habakkuk, yet a little while, and the coming one will come and will not delay. But my righteous one shall live by faith, and if he shrinks back, my soul has no pleasure in him. But we are not of those who shrink back and are destroyed, but of those who have faith and preserve their souls or their lives. Interesting, as he prepares them to understand the role of faith, he reminds them that in the past they had operated on faith. Their faith was beginning to wane, but he calls them back to remember what it was that enabled them to endure the hardships and the difficulties that they had faced early on in their Christian experience. What was it that had enabled them? Well, he says specifically that they accepted these things because they knew, in verse 34, that they had better and lasting possessions. That's an issue of faith. Faith in the promise of God. That the temporal experiences were nothing, the temporal hardships were nothing compared to the glory that would be revealed, to quote Romans chapter 8. If we think about the argument of the book as a whole, all the way back in chapter 2, the first warning that he gave them was that they were neglecting their salvation. They were drifting from the great truths of God's triumph through Christ, of this ultimate salvation that he would bring when he would liberate planet Earth, when these lasting and better possessions that they would be given would come to them. They were neglecting that. They were drifting from that. And because they were drifting from that, they were weakening in their faith, in their confidence, and their ability then to persevere. I want to take a moment and think about the pattern of pastoral practice that flows so clearly in these last verses in chapter 10. The pattern is made up of ideas that have constantly surfaced throughout the letter. Things like perseverance and confidence and faith and truth, the thing believed. In verse 34, we've already seen that these Hebrews believed that they had better and lasting possessions. In other words, they understood the truth. They understood something of that salvation that now they were beginning to allow to slip from their grip. So there was truth, and that is always the foundational element. We've talked before about this, that the truth is the fodder of faith. And the truth is essentially made up of the truth about God and his promises. You have to have both. You have to understand the promise of God, but you need to know as well the God who is able to keep and bring about his promise regardless of the circumstances at hand. This is exactly where the wilderness generation failed. They knew that God had promised to give them that land, but they forgot that God was greater than the giants and the walls of the land, and that God could bring about the promise. So the truth is about God and his promise. But then that always calls forth a response, and that's what we call faith. In other words, seeing the reality of God and his promise. Seeing these as real. And we're going to see when we get into chapter 11, that's essentially what faith is. Faith is seeing the things that God has said about himself and what he has promised to do as if they were as real as this table. That's what faith does. So faith is seeing the reality of God and his promise, not just knowing it, not just having the information, but now it becomes a way of seeing everything else, a part of our worldview, as it were. And then you'll notice here that he calls them and he says, do not, in verse 36, throw away your confidence. We saw earlier in this chapter, in chapter 10, in the last video, that confidence was really was critical at this point. If they believed what he had taught them about the new covenant, if they believed what he had taught them about the high priesthood of Christ, they would draw near to God and find what they needed. But if they didn't believe it, they wouldn't have the confidence to draw near. Confidence is the courage to act on faith. And so he says to him, don't throw away this confidence, this boldness, this courage that allows you to act in the world in line with the things that you believe to be true about God and his promises. And then finally, the last element is the element of perseverance. And of course, he tells them, for you need, in verse 36, endurance. And endurance is simply persisting at doing the will of God. You have need of endurance so that when you have done the will of God, you will inherit what he has promised. And again, immediately into our minds has to jump this issue of the wilderness wanderings. They did not persevere. Because of their lack of faith, the absence of confidence in God and his promise, they did not persevere in doing the will of God, and so they did not inherit that which was promised. And there are a lot of times in our lives in this world that we miss the promises of God. The ones that we could have right now. Don't even think about the ones that pertain to the future. But the promises that he wants us to have right now, we lose because we don't respond to the truth with faith, experience confidence, and then persist in doing the will of God. So this is what he's calling forth here. And he's not just telling them, persevere, grit your teeth and persevere in some animalistic way. No, not at all. He has done all of the pastoral work necessary to legitimize his call to perseverance. And I think as those involved in Christian ministry, we always have to remember that. We shouldn't just be those who are articulating instructions, do this, do this, do this. We should be those who are laying the foundation that people need if they are going to persist in doing the will of God. So that is the background, and that leads up to then this statement about Habakkuk. And if there was ever someone who illustrated these principles, this model that I've just talked to you about of the truth and of faith and of confidence and perseverance, it would have to be Habakkuk. You know his story. The man was struggling. He looked out at Judah and he saw nothing but injustice. His fellow Jews were treating each other poorly. They were not following the law of God. And so he complained to God and said, how can you just allow this to go on unchecked? And God speaks to him and tells him something that makes him even more confused. I'm not going to leave it unchecked. I'm going to come in and judge them with the Babylonians, which created even greater consternation for Habakkuk, because now he's thinking, the Jews are bad, but the Babylonians are even worse. How can you use the Babylonians to judge your people? And then God says to him, look, the only way forward for you is to live by faith. And it's unfortunate that Habakkuk 2:4 has been kind of kidnapped by Reformed thinking and associated almost exclusively with justification by faith, because that's not the original context. The original context is how a believer makes it in this life. How do we persevere? How do we find the confidence that we need to persevere? We believe the promise of God. And Habakkuk did that. And as a result of believing the promise of God, his circumstances did not change. Judah remained ungodly and unjust, and the Babylonians would come, and devastation would surround his life. But he knew that God would keep his promise. And so after hearing of all the devastation that would come and how God would resolve the problem of the injustice of his people and the injustice of the Babylonians, he says this. He prays this, the prayer of the prophet Habakkuk, according to Shigionoth. O Lord, I have heard the report of you and your work. O Lord, I do fear. That's a statement of faith. In the Old Testament, the fear of God is the closest expression to faith in God that we have. He's basically saying, O Lord, I heard the report of you and what you do, and I believe. And then he rehearses all of the devastations that will come. And in verse 17, we have this magnificent prayer of faith. He says, and you know it well, though the fig tree should not blossom, nor fruit be on the vines, the produce of the olive fail, and the fields yield no fruit, the flock be cut off from the fold, and there be no herd in the stalls, yet I'll rejoice in the Lord. I will take joy in the God of my salvation. God, the Lord, is my strength. He makes my feet like the deer's. He makes me tread on my high places. Now that is the response of faith. As I said, nothing in his circumstances changed. But because he believed, he had confidence in the promise of God, and he could persist in doing the will of God in circumstances we cannot even begin to imagine. And that's what our writer is calling the Hebrews to. And that is where he will go now in chapter 11, as he urges them to have this kind of faith, and once again teaches them and then gives them illustrations of many people who walked exactly where they're walking. So as we turn the page into chapter 11, our writer begins by giving us a definition of faith, or explaining a few things about faith in these very well-known verses. In chapter 11, verse 1, now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. We should say that this is true of all faith, whether it's the faith of an Islamist or a Hindu or of an atheist. Their faith is the assurance of things unseen and the evidence of things that are hoped for. Other way around. The assurance of things hoped for and the evidence of things unseen. So in one sense, Hebrews 11:1 is not an adequate definition of faith. I think we mentioned earlier that the best definition of faith in the Bible is in Romans chapter 4. It says that Abraham was fully persuaded. That's what this is talking about. That's Hebrews 11:1, persuasion. Abraham was fully persuaded that what God promised, he was able to perform. Now, those three elements are true of biblical faith. The persuasion part, the psychological part that Hebrews 11:1 talks about, but you have to add to that what that persuasion is directed at. It's directed at God. God is able, and it's directed at his promise, what he has specifically said he would do. Abraham was fully persuaded that what God promised, he was also able to perform. The ability of God and the promise of God. Hebrews 11 assumes those because they've been coming up time and again. But I'm just saying this so you don't think that Hebrews 11 is an adequate definition of biblical faith. It just talks about the psychological dimension. And in that psychological dimension, he mentions two things. First of all, he says that it's the assurance, or the hypostasis. This word is an interesting word because it talks about reality, the ground of being. And what he's saying is that faith makes the things that we hope for real. It helps us to see them as a part of our understanding of reality. Not simply confession, but our actual view of reality is shaped by faith. Then he goes on and he says that not only that, but faith provides the evidence of the unseen things in our lives. Another strong word, elektos, which means to argue or provide evidence of something. So the English translation says it's the conviction, or it provides the evidence for the unseen things, which are again the subject of God's promise. Once again, this must always be circumscribed by the revelation of God. Faith is not like magic. Magic is a way of manipulating deities. Faith is a response to the revelation of God. We don't manipulate God by faith. We don't make God do what we want him to do. That's magic. Faith is a response to what God has said he wants to do. So if God is silent, that thing cannot be the object of faith. We can hope for something, we can desire something, but we cannot claim it in faith if God has not promised it. All right? So right away he starts by explaining this psychological dimension of faith. And then he goes on and he talks about faith is that which brings about the blessing of God. So in verse 3, by faith we understand, verse 2, for by it people of old received their commendation. In other words, God values faith. In Galatians it says, the only thing that counts is faith operating through love. That's all. That's all that matters. So what God is looking for us is a response of faith. Why? Because that will produce everything else. Everything springs from faith. That's Romans. And then he tells us that not only that, but faith gives us the ability to understand things as they truly are, as they really are. And that makes sense. A materialist just believes that reality is what he or she can experience. That's materialism. All that exists in reality is what I can experiment with or see. But a believer, a Christian, believes that reality is not only the created universe, but it's God. It's all of these unseen realities that God has revealed to us. And so the writer says here in verse 3, by faith we understand that the universe was created by the word of God, so that what is seen was made out of things that are visible, so that what is seen was not made out of things that are visible. Now, here's the ultimate dilemma. We can say that, we can argue for the plausibility of creation by divine fiat, but we can never prove it, any more than anything about the origins of the earth can actually be proven, because there is no way to historically verify any of it or to reproduce it. So it's going to be a faith response. And when we understand the revelation of God, what God has said about the creation of the world, we understand things differently. Everything will cascade from that original creative act of God, ethics, morality, our place in the world, all of it. So he says, in a sense, what he's saying here is that faith gives us the ability to understand things differently, to see things as they really are, whereas a materialist is really suffering from phenomenal tunnel vision. And then he goes on and he talks about all of these people who have lived by faith. And of course, the logic of this point is very clear. The Hebrews felt like a minority. They felt like a sect. They were a dishonorable minority in the society at large. But our writer is saying to them, no, there's a great group of people who testify to the honorable nature of living by faith, ultimately the victory, and how that this, in the courtroom of heaven, there is so much greater honor bequeathed to those that will walk by faith. And then the writer illustrates this. And every one of these people that he mentions are people that are on pilgrimage. They never really arrived at the place they were hoping to be, or they never received completely the promises they believed as they walked by faith. But they were also a bit of a rogues gallery. They were far from perfect. And though our writer doesn't mention this, I'm sure that he's aware, he expects such a knowledge of the Old Testament in the readers of this letter, that he knows that his readers will be thinking in terms of the fact that these were fallible people who, though they held on to the promise, often surrendered to their circumstances and failed in their walk with God. And yet, there's a value to that, because what the writer is saying is that weak people, fallible people, walk by faith. And that ultimately the issue isn't that they fall, but they get back up. That's what faith does. Faith enables us to get back up and to continue to pursue a course of life that is driven principally by faith. And so in one sense, at the end of the day, all that matters is faith. Yes, these people's lives were marked by failure. Moses' life was marked by failure. Abraham's life was marked by failure. But ultimately, their failure didn't define them. What defined them was their faith, because they never quit. They persevered, even though they were... And to be honest, the greatest temptation to give up, the greatest temptation to not persevere, it doesn't come from society at large, but it comes from our conscience, from our inner self that says, wow, you're too much of a failure to believe that this road is for you. And everything that our writer taught us in chapters 8, 9, and 10 is designed to drown out that voice in our hearts and remind us that we are forgiven, that we are perfected, that we belong to Jesus, and that when we fail, we should just get up and pursue that which faith sets before us. And so he goes through all of these that walked in this, and ends, of course, in chapter 12 with the greatest example of living by faith, and that is Jesus, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising its shame, and then received the better and lasting possessions, and sat down at the right hand of the glory of God. And he did it by faith. And so the capstone of all of this, of these people who walked by faith, is ultimately Christ.